I'm Francesca. Welcome to Becoming More Human, the podcast. Every generation, through its arts and creativity, explores the same questions. Who am I, and what really matters? We are so often taught how to emulate others, to make other people happy. But how do we access what's good for ourselves and be strong enough to actually claim it? It's a constant practice because we all keep evolving. There are no limits to personal growth. You can start your journey today and get closer to discovering your true self. Give back to the people around you and make the world a better place.
Hello listeners, on today's episode I'm talking with Katinka Blackford Newman. She is an award-winning documentary film director and has worked in television for over 25 years for major international broadcasters, including Discovery, National Geographic, HBO Max, BBC, ITV and Channel 4. In 2016, she penned a best-selling book based on her own real-life story called The Pill That Steals Lives. It's a personal memoir and investigation based on her own experience with prescription drugs, which led to a year-long illness that nearly caused her to lose her own life. The book was subsequently made into a 1-hour special Panorama investigation TV documentary. This episode comes with a trigger warning. Katinka discusses suicide and the risks of prescription drugs. It's an informative, inspiring and a heartfelt discussion about Katinka's journey. So enough from me, and let's jump straight in.
So my name is Katinka Blackford Newman. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have become an expert on antidepressants because of a personal experience which led me to writing a book and to setting up a campaign to warn people about the potentially dangerous side effects of antidepressants. So whilst I'm not at all anti-medication, and I think they can be really helpful to some people to give them a window of opportunity to deal with whatever stresses they might be having to confront, and they can numb people, they can numb people's emotions. Sometimes that can be really helpful. There are a small minority of people like myself who have a very, very severe reaction to antidepressants, as I was to discover. And the purpose of my campaign is to warn people about how they can potentially have life-threatening consequences to a small minority of people, and also even to the people who react well to antidepressants. They can cause dependency, and I really hope that my campaign and my book just gives people the facts so that they can make their own opinions about whether to take medication.
Well, I would like to go back to sort of the start of your story, and there's a little bit in the book that I'm going to read out because it sort of really hit home for me of how the story started for you and how it can start for so many in terms of that place that you were in at that time and those feelings and what you were going through. So in relation to your marriage at the time, you said, the best I can do to describe it is that it didn't feel like love, that our marriage was a deceptive as the facade of our Victorian house in Queen's Park. Yes, we looked the part, Robert and I. And then later on in the same paragraph, you go on to say, the smart-looking house hid a stash of cheap IKEA furniture and things that didn't work. So our relationship was not quite what the world saw. That resonated. That's just a small part, Katinka, of the sort of the beginning, setting the scene of the relationship and the life that you were leading at that time. Can you expand a bit more about how you were feeling at that time and what was going on?
Yes, I mean, I think that like many people, I was drawn into the kind of media image of what love was about and what a perfect relationship would look like. So it looked great. He is a lawyer. I'm a documentary filmmaker. We had 2 children. We were quite wealthy. We had a lovely house, but the foundations of our relationship were not strong. They weren't really about giving to each other. It was more about what we could get out of the relationship than what we could give, which of course is a lifelong is a lifelong journey in a sense, isn't it? It's the journey of getting away from kind of young, selfish ego to a more mature view of love. And some people get there quicker than others. And it's taken me an awfully long time. And certainly when I got married, which was in my early 30s, I didn't have the tools to have a really loving relationship. I didn't love myself enough. I certainly didn't have the tools to love somebody else. That was for sure. I had had a very traumatic childhood, as you've read in the book. My father killed himself when I was 12 years old. I had never really dealt with that. And I'd lost my family home. And so I was very keen to replace that at whatever cost. So when my husband at that time came along, I was so... I was like a 12-year-old who wanted who wanted all of that back, the lost child back. And so I lost my family and my childhood home when I was 12 years old. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, our marriage lasted exactly 12 years. And it was the loss of our family home that actually precipitated me into a near breakdown and led me to taking that first antidepressant. So I think when you go when you go into a relationship wanting something, and when you will go into certainly if you are going into a relationship trying to compensate for something that you didn't get earlier on, you're immediately going in wanting something rather than going into it thinking of what you can give. So I think love is about giving without the expectation of getting anything in return. Well, nothing, let me tell you, nothing could have been further from the truth when I went into that relationship.
It sounds like in the book you were really living the high life. It was like the fairy tale. You were going on the holidays, you had the house, a nanny. You really did have everything that you could say was a fairy tale. And at what point did you feel that all slipping away and that you were trying to sort of grapple to hold on to it all?
I think we got married very quickly, and it was because I would have precipitated it, and it would have been out of fear. I was grabbing hold of this fairy tale. And certainly in the early parts of our courtship, it was all about parties. We were always planning something. It was the next party, this big wedding, this big honeymoon. Then I got pregnant very quickly, and it was big children's party. It was all adrenaline. You didn't kind of like really sit down and watch TV much and have a takeaway. There wasn't much downtime at all. It was like constantly we were living this high octane lifestyle, and I think it was because actually that we probably didn't have that much in common, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we were great parents because we were polar opposites. We didn't have much understanding. We didn't have a proper emotional connection.
Yeah, when did that start to come in for you, that sort of the personal breakdown for you, and when you could feel mentally and physically you were starting to change? It wasn't
about 5 years into my marriage, I discovered that my husband was having that he had got very close to somebody at work, and that there was a level of deception that I found very worrying. At the time, we had 2 young children. I was not a great partner to be with at the time. So I completely acknowledge my part in all of this, which is that we did have this dream life. We had nannies. I could have gone back to work. We had this beautiful house, but I didn't have an inner sense of contentment. And so I was quite miserable to be around. I was just moaning all the time, constantly critical. Things weren't absolutely perfect. I would just moan all the time. And looking back, how lucky was I? I I mean, okay, it was hard work having two children there was just a year between them. Yeah, it was hard work, but it wasn't that hard work. And actually, that's the price that you pay for parenthood, kind of thing. But I didn't really have that. It was kind of like I wanted everything. I didn't want to sacrifice my freedom for the kids. I wanted it all, sort of thing. So that phase led him to look for intimacy outside of the marriage. And so there was a level of deception there. So that was the first sign that we were not living a life of transparency, really, and honesty and emotional closeness. And that I'd been, I'm not condoning that anyone should seek intimacy outside of their marriage, but I certainly acknowledge my part in that. So that happened then. And then it happened again a few years later. And at that point, I had embarked then on a path of growth. I'd gone on a personal development program called the Landmark Forum, and I was suddenly surrounded with all of these people who actually it was all about kind of contribution and growth and integrity and honesty, these sorts of things. And actually, I just realised these weren't values that had kind of really come my way, particularly, and that set me on this path where it then became intolerable to be in that marriage, because that marriage was about keeping me small. I wanted to be small in that marriage. I wanted to be a kind of child. I wanted to relive this childhood that I hadn't had. I didn't want to grow up. I didn't really want to take any responsibility. I'd certainly really not considered a role of I never would wake up and think to myself, how am I contributing to the world? That would never have occurred to me at all. But that became interesting and attractive. And there was no place for that in my marriage. There really wasn't. It was a marriage that was based on deception and a lack of integrity for both parties. And suddenly that became more important to me than anything. And I was surrounded by a community of people who were able to kind of help me grow in that way and were able to let me see that my marriage was a bit of a trap. It was a place where I really wasn't going to be able to grow.
It's so interesting. What made you sort of make that jump into looking into the self-development? I mean, this is all happening pre going into sort of taking antidepressants. So you were starting to go on that journey where you were trying to find out more about yourself. And did finding out more about yourself make it harder? In fact, did it really show up all the problems even more? And actually that's not being able to communicate that with your husband, by the sounds of it, did that make things harder between the two of you?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I remember coming back and one of the tenets of this program is all about integrity and honesty. And I remember coming back and talking to my husband about that and saying, look, are there any secrets that we need to talk about? And he was like, whoa, he really didn't want to go into that arena at all. That was a warning sign that, that whole world would not have interested him at all. And it really showed me that there was a huge gap between what was to become important to me. It wasn't then at the time, but this is the area in which I've grown and is incredibly important to me. I mean, I do a lot of personal development work now. I meditate. I go on a lot of courses. I'm just fascinated by that aspect of humanity, and it's given me an understanding of myself. It's allowed me to be able to forgive myself for being a bit of a spoilt brat, actually, that really I had a huge trauma when I was young that I was never able to deal with. And I covered it up with addictions, actually, at the time. And I think that probably was the thing that spurred me to go to various self-development courses. I had a food addiction, not just food, but a kind of like really an eating disorder, actually. I was either overeating or I was under eating as a way of trying to control my environment. And so that was probably the thing that propelled me to in the direction of personal growth. But then it opened up a whole new world. Then I realized that there was just so much more that I was missing out on. And that actually, if you're concerned with looking good, I don't mean just physically, but just generally, if you're living life, we're so wonderful, we've got these great holidays in the Maldives and we've got this big house, etc., etc. What it's depriving you is of the opportunity to connect. And human connection is the most important thing. It's more important than anything at all. And if you're having to
absolutely
of looking good, like dream life, you're not going to be able to connect, because connection is about being vulnerable and about being honest. And so people who are living that life are fundamentally incredibly lonely, as I was. I somehow had to show the world that I had this amazing life. I must have deserved it somehow, that I'd had this very challenging childhood where we hadn't had very much money, and I was living we didn't have any money, but I was in these very posh boarding schools and things, and somehow I felt that it was my fault somehow. And so somehow living this wonderful life, to me, it was like I was saying to people, hey, look at me, I've deserved this. Well, of course
I deserve it, exactly.
I hadn't deserved it at all. I just sort of landed there.
It's like slowly orchestrating your own life and building it according to what you think it should be, rather than what it actually is.
Absolutely. And I had built a narrative of a I'm a storyteller, really. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a storyteller. So I built this story, a fairy tale story of, she's had a tough childhood, and then she meets her Prince Charming, and they all live happily ever after, 2 children and the dream life. Well, that was my narrative, and that there'd be an ending, but but unfortunately, that fairy tale ending was flawed in so many different ways, because life is not like that at all. There's no fairy tale ending. It's all about growth.
And well, at that point where you're starting to have a bit of an awakening as to your situation, and you've obviously trying to speak with your husband and deal with the issues head on, when you realized that this wasn't going to go anywhere and his honesty wasn't being reflected back, how did you then deal with it? What was the next path that you took?
I was really strong, and I ended the marriage, and that was incredibly hard for me to do. But I was really clear about it, and I asked him to move out. And the children, I think, were 9 and 10 at the time. He moved out of our house. He was devastated, but I really had given it everything, and there was just no way forward at all, because he wasn't prepared to be transparent and live and to keep to our marriage vows, really. So I ended it, and then I embarked on a life of being single. And I did very well for 8 months, and he had left me in our family home, and I just launched myself into being a single woman. But at the back of my mind, I just wanted to meet somebody else. I wanted to kind of, was still hanging on to the fairy tale. I still wanted somebody to come and rescue me, some lovely alpha male who was going to make it all right. And things were okay for about 8 months, and then I hit an absolute wall of despair, because I'd assumed that my husband would let me keep the house where I had been with the children, and he then said that he wasn't going to do that, and we were going to have to sell the house. That caused me such pain, because again, it was a rerun for me of losing my family home at the age of 12. And also because the children, that whatever happened, that whilst Mummy and Daddy were breaking up, we were always going to live in this house.
Right.
And we had a beautiful...
So it was almost that pain from you as a child actually coming back in its droves. And at the time, did you relate to that pain as childhood pain, or were you not able to make that connection at that point?
I didn't make the connection. I never dealt with it as a child. I have no memory of saying goodbye to the house. I just know that we had a house with a big white house with a guinea pig and a rabbit and 2 cats, and it was far from perfect in that things were very difficult with my parents at the time, but there was an edifice of normality. And I don't recall it, but it disappeared. I don't have any recollection at all of the removal men coming or whatever. And it may well have been that I was away at boarding school. I may not have been there. But anyway, reliving that at 12 years into my marriage, and I'd been 12 years old when I'd lost my house, I didn't make the connection at all. I just went into a spiral of total despair. And I just couldn't see past it. I couldn't see what's really obvious to anybody, which is, well, there's going to be another house. There's going to be another home. It's not going to be as big as that, but it's not the end of the world. It's going to, there's still going to be a home with me and the children, albeit on our own. But somehow, when you can't see a future, that's when you go into despair. That when you're unable to see something, and I was unable to see to the other side of it, and all I remember is just having sleepless nights. I just couldn't sleep, and I couldn't sleep, and I was doing this job, making a documentary, and I just thought, I'm going to go mad if I had some sleeping tablets at the time for jet lag, and so I was taking those. And of course, what I know now, sometimes I don't sleep now, and I know that after 2 nights, I'll go to sleep.
Yeah, actually, Katinka, you mentioned there's a bit in the book on this that really resonated. And you say, the biggest lesson I've learned out of all of this is that anxiety and sleepless nights are invaluable. They're a signal that things aren't okay, and acknowledging it will give you the key to solve whatever the problem is.
It's absolutely right.
And
it's absolutely right.
And that's, such an important part, right? That's a real pivotal moment in everything that then sort of happened after that.
Yes, absolutely. I know it sounds really harsh, and I'm sure that people listening to this will just go, you know what she's talking about. Because actually, it's awful when you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're so anxious. But certainly it's part of my journey that whatever I'm feeling, I will feel. And sometimes it has been the key. Sometimes I've woken up with such acute loneliness that I've just thought, I've got to do something about this. I'm lonely, so I need to reach out. Or sometimes I've woken up with acute financial fears, and it's just led me to have to go and do something about it. And I genuinely think if I had just listened to that anxiety around the house at the time, I would have just gone, you've got to get through this. You get to an estate agent quickly, see what you can afford, have a meeting with your lawyer, see how much money you're going to have. Is this fear that you're going to, being out on the street, is it real? Is that really going to happen? Well, no, it's not. I'm going to be living in a not as nice house in a not nice neighborhood, but that's going to be reality. And actually reality is, there's some saying, I think, that we suffer more in imagination than we do in reality. And actually, it's just, things are generally not as bad as you think. But the more you put something off, the worse it gets. And so that is an issue with addiction, isn't it? That you kind of like drink to drown your sorrows, instead of, like, you're lonely, you drink, you get more lonely, you drink more, you get more, and so on and so forth. You just go into a spiral. Whereas actually, if you do that, if you were to just go, God, I'm really lonely. Loneliness means I need connection. How am I going to do? If you really sit with those feelings, sometimes the solution will come to you. Generally, it does.
Absolutely. And it sounds like, as at one point you were really in control. You were looking at the self-development journey. You had approached your husband, you had made the decision to call it off. So it sounds like there was 2 things at play almost without you realizing it. It's you're in control of your own life. You understand that you need to make some changes and you're being super smart. And then the triggering factor of the home being sold without you realizing it just reflected back to your childhood. And actually the self-development that you had been on, did that then suddenly get pushed aside? It was almost like everything became irrelevant at that point because you were almost just blindsided by this pain and trauma from previous, years that, like you said, you blocked it out, and that sort of crept back in at that time. And did that happen for you? Did the self-development just fall by the wayside, or did you try and put things into practice and think, I need to get my head around this? But in the end, the pain won, I guess.
It's a really good question. If I'm brutally honest with myself, I think at this point there was a self-sabotage that was coming in. I think there was an undercurrent of thought which was going, what the hell was I thinking about? Thinking, oh, I'm okay on my own. I'm this strong, independent woman. I think possibly I was like an alcoholic reaching for a drink. I was slightly just thinking, I'm not sure that I can cope with this all on my own. All this stuff about I can be a mother on my own. I'm not sure that I can cope without my husband. All of it was just it really was too much. It was like, as I say, it was like being on halfway up a mountain and just going, I'm not sure I can do this. Or I've run half marathons, and there's always a point where I just go, no, why did I do this? Get me out of here.
And it sounds like you were a pressure cooker at this stage. You're starting to drink a bit more. You're noticing, you're taking, sleeping pills, which isn't something that you usually do. And did that start to spiral? Do more things start to slowly seep into your life that you didn't usually do? And how did that then lead you on to take antidepressants?
It happened so quickly. It really did. It was just like, I remember the impulse to want to run away. And over a course of days, I literally went from being a teetotaler to having not a huge amount, but a glass of wine or whatever, sleeping tablets. And I remember that having a quite detrimental effect on me. And I remember thinking, Christ, what the hell am I going to do when I run out of these sleeping tablets? And not thinking, oh, I'll, go in my own time to the doctor. It was like, I've got to get to the doctor because I'm not going to sleep tonight. What will I do if I don't sleep tonight? Then I won't be able to get to work. And then if I can't work, then I'll lose my job, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was an urgency about it. And so that's when I went to a doctor. He wouldn't give me a sleeping tablet. So then I ended up, we had private health insurance. And I ended up going to a private doctor who said, I will give you he said, I think he said, I can give you a sleeping tablet for one night, but what will help you to sleep is an antidepressant. And he also kind of convinced me that I was depressed as well. And I was just like, well, if it'll help me to sleep, I was like, or it'll help me to feel better, why not?
And at that stage, antidepressants are being widely spoken about. People are taking them, and we're not hearing much more than if you have signs of depression, then here's the magic pill and you're going to be better. And, your situation is that, you can't sleep, and maybe these are the early signs of depression, and here's a pill, off you go. Yeah.
Absolutely. And also, I suppose at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I really wanted to be better. I wanted to be a bit feeble. I've had 8 months of being strong and capable. Probably part of me wanted to be
interesting.
Safe. I was like, right, okay, well, let's I'll be saved all round by doctors, husband. I'll take whatever's going now.
That's so interesting, Katinka, because obviously you can have that now with foresight. It's that idea of just being gently supported by everybody, and you're allowed to go back to that childlike state, and you just need looking after, which is what really, humans need care. We want to be looked after as well as looking after others. And in that moment, it was part of your process of actually, this is going to make me better and I'm being looked after. And also attention as well. I'd imagine it was nice, everybody sort of then caring about you, asking about you, and
yes,
psyche then switches a little bit.
Totally. And I'd had 8 months of kind of like, hey, look at me, I'm coping completely so well, etc. And that wasn't realistic either. I don't really remember just sitting around moping, let's not. I don't remember sitting around grieving and just going, Christ, this is really hard. I was a bit kind of like, hey, I'll make lots of new friends. I'll go out. I'll go running. I'll go on holiday. I'll make new friends. I was a bit like, I'm just going to be the poster woman for how to break up with your husband really easily.
Yes.
Me as well. Slightly wanted. Hey, look at me. How great I am without you. I'm running half marathons and I'm going on holiday with new friends and doing this and doing that. Ha, ha, ha.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So there was all of that going on. And then really, I hadn't really been real about it. And my friends had said at the time, you're not really being, I was all kind of like, oh, my life is so much better than it used to be with my ex. And it's real because however, there may have been things that were better, but the reality is that if you've been with someone for 12 years and you've lost them, you've lost a hell of a lot. You've lost a partner, you've lost life, you've lost an identity, you've lost their physical presence. There's an awful lot to be grieving. Can't really shortcut that process. People try to do that an awful lot with, you can try numbing stuff with drink and stuff. I didn't really do that, but I kind of like numbed. I wasn't good at sitting with feelings of grief and loss and sorrow.
Had you been to a therapist or anything before any of this had happened? Have you experienced counselling?
I had experienced counselling. I wasn't in therapy at the time because I was like, oh, I don't need it. I was like, I'm absolutely fine. Totally don't need it. I think at the end of that, I just started to see a therapist actually because I was just suddenly like, oh, there's just stuff that I have to deal with here that I haven't really processed. And that this kind of this persona that I created for myself of, oh, I'm just going out and dating loads of gorgeous guys and I'm just going to meet somebody else and quite come to fruition, that me just sailing off into the distance and meeting somebody else and living this dream life, another dream life, that wasn't quite happening. And I think I was being hit with grief, actually, just terrible grief. And actually that grief is a good thing. It doesn't go completely. Of course it lessens, but it's really good to feel sadness. Sometimes my children are 18, no, they're not, they're 20 and 21. But when I walk past playgrounds sometimes I feel overwhelmed with sadness. It's not a bad thing. It's not that I want them to be 4 and 5 again. But actually I'm just sad that time has passed, that they're never going to be children again. And that's fine. It's okay to feel those feelings. It really is. But as a society, we're not great at embracing emotions. We're kind of like, sadness, right? Oh, why are you sad? Do you want them to be children again? No, I don't want them to be children. I'm just mourning the loss of that time, that life will never be the same again. Life is going to be good. It's going to be great, but it's not going to be the same. And I still sometimes feel sadness about the end of our marriage. I still mourn the loss of those family holidays or whatever. And that's not a bad thing at all. But I don't think that I had that in my head, that you could be grieving something and that that's a good thing. I had that as kind of like, it's a bad thing. What am I doing feeling those feelings? I need to feel really excited about the future or et cetera, et cetera. Grief is something that I hadn't learned as being a good thing, which is not surprising because what I'd had as a child, where the feelings would have been so overwhelming for a 12-year-old to lose her dad to a suicide and to lose my home. Of course, that would have been, it's a trauma too much. I'm not saying lots of people have these traumas that they're unable to process. And that happened to me. So I wasn't particularly adept at emotions.
As well as feeling vulnerable and needing that support, were you also not allowing people in to help you almost as well, to sort of give you those, do you need to go and see a therapist? What else can we do other than just basically giving you antidepressants?
Yeah, I don't think that at the time, I think I was so enamored of this persona that I had, that everything was fine, which is the persona that I'd, of course, had in my marriage. That somehow it was a sign of weakness to not be okay. If I particularly let people in, I don't think that there was. Yeah, and it was like the facade had just crumbled, sort of thing. It was like, okay, that was all a bit of a show that I was putting on for the benefit of that. I was this sort of that I was coping. Oh, I mean, I was coping fairly well, but I certainly didn't open myself up to people to tell them about the real grief that I was feeling, or perhaps to myself. So possibly my psyche was a bit relieved to stop the kind of mirage of this charade of being totally fine and that everything was all absolutely perfect. So it might have been a relief to just go, actually, I'm not feeling too great. Okay, so for people who are listening who don't know this, that there are 2 to 5% of people who have a life-threatening reaction to antidepressants, and it can be really serious. So people who can't tolerate metabolized antidepressants, there are various terms for it, but one of them is serotonin syndrome, where basically your body can't metabolize the antidepressants, or it can't tolerate the antidepressants. So there's this sort of concentration of, this is what is thought, nobody really knows, but concentration of serotonin in your brain. And in my case, I went into a total psychosis. Well, it meant that I couldn't sleep at all for possibly probably 2 whole nights. So the first sign that your body isn't tolerating this medication is that you go into toxicity, and you develop this thing which is very painful called akathisia, where your body is just you can't sit still at all. So you're constant. It's like having a kind of movement disorder. So you're pacing up and down. It's impossible to sleep, even with sleeping tablets. And it is a really, really painful condition, and your mind just goes totally blank. It's the reason that some people kill themselves very shortly after taking an antidepressant. It is because it's not because they're so depressed they can't bear life. It's because they have gone into this condition called akathisia, which is intolerable. The physical agony is so great that they end up just jumping off bridges or balconies or whatever. So I remember having this, and it happened on and off for the next year, as we'll discuss. But anyway, I remember having this and going into a trance. Then I was unable to sleep for 2 nights, and then bang, one minute, I went into a terrifying psychosis, which lasted 4 days. And it was the most terrifying, one of the most terrifying things that I've experienced in my life.
And so in terms of when your doctor prescribed you these pills and you were going there for sleeping, essentially, you wanted to be able to sleep better, you then suddenly find that you're not sleeping any better. By that stage, do you feel disconnected with yourself, that you can't really distinguish the fact that you went to a doctor for sleeping pills, so that's it, you're already well into the pills?
Totally. I mean, the reaction to antidepressants can happen like within an hour. So once I'd taken that, all bets were off, because I didn't really know what was happening. I was in a trance, much like someone would have been if you'd taken a recreational drug and it had gone badly. That would be a comparison. I mean, I was just out of it. I mean, I was totally out of it when I went into the psychosis, but building up to that, there was, with the akathisia and so on, I was in trance. I wouldn't have been able to talk, articulate, function. I wouldn't have been able to string a sentence together. I didn't know what was happening to me. All I knew was that moving. I didn't really know what was happening. My body just had involuntary movements. And, I mean, if you Google akathisia, you can see videos of who have it. And it's an absolutely terrifying condition. So all bets were off. I didn't really know what was happening then at all. And then certainly once I had psychosis, I mean, really, that was a totally altered reality, as you know, because you read the book.
Yes. Could you describe a bit about what happened during that time?
The psychosis?
Yes.
Okay, well, I remember it very clearly, which is that I suddenly I was hallucinating, really. I remember looking down as if from above, as if I was out of my body, seeing myself stabbed my stomach and blood pouring out. I remember thinking that I was in a dream, in a sort of video game, and that nothing, or something like that, and that nothing really mattered. So I could easily have just done anything because I would have just gone, oh, this doesn't matter because we're in a dream. So people who have antidepressant-induced psychosis, as you know, because you read the book, quite often go on to kill other people, themselves, other people, or acts of mass violence. It is because they think they're in a dream. They don't know what's happening. And there was this feeling of extraordinary sort of numbness, this feeling that an emotional anesthesia, that nothing mattered. We were in a dream anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered if I killed myself, killed the children or whatever, because we were all going to wake up. So that was part of it. And then there was another part where I actually thought I'd killed the children. I mean, it didn't make any sense to me, because then the next moment, running into Queen's Park, I physically did run to my local park to try and find them, which doesn't make any sense because I'd killed them. And I do remember watching the TV and seeing news reports about me having killed the children. I actually remember that. And I also remember then suddenly the most scary thing was that I was suddenly on this, like the Truman Show, and what was happening to me being broadcast to the nation. And I remember believing that we were on this complicated game show, and the audience, which was the whole world, because everyone was watching this, everybody was voting on whether Jeremy was my ex-husband, whether he or I was a better parent. And so the whole thing was a test. And it was just awful because everybody was voting for him, and that everyone knew that I was a terrible mother because I'd killed the children, and there were sort of clips being shown of sort of terrible things that I'd done in the past, and everybody was vote. It was just this horrible paranoia. It was a kind of like paranoid psychosis that everything was being filmed and broadcast to the nation.
It's absolutely petrifying, and it's not something that we hear every day when we hear the word antidepressant.
An antidepressant-induced psychosis is incredibly rare, but the characteristics are the same, which is that people hallucinate about knives, killing themselves, killing other people. And so that's why I mean, this sounds like a kind of like weird conspiracy theory, but this is true. And as you probably know, the research from the book was then made into a Panorama investigation called The Prescription for Murder, which was mass killing, and about how antidepressants have been linked to acts of violence. And it's because of this, which is that when people go into an antidepressant-induced psychosis, they start hallucinating about knives, dying, etc., etc. And in some instances, they take to violence. And there have been cases where courts have found that people have killed other people, quite often people close to them, as a direct result of antidepressants.
And
so,
it's,
as it may sound, you can argue with judges on this one because there is enough evidence to link antidepressants with acts of intense violence. And I would have thought that this was a completely outlandish claim were it not for the fact that it had happened to me and that I was hallucinating that I'd killed my children. I could easily have killed my children, I believe. And there was a point when I took a knife and I attacked myself. I thought I'd attack the children, but I ended up with a lacerated arm. I've interviewed people who ended up in prison, and you may remember there's a man who I became close to who took antidepressants, and he went into an antidepressant-induced psychosis. He strangled his son.
That story particularly stands out in the book. It's horrifying.
And he's a completely normal, loving father who strangled his son when in an antidepressant-induced psychosis, and he now campaigns for greater awareness. I know that people listening to this are going to think, is this woman for real? But the research is there.
No, absolutely. I think, you document it in such detail in the book. Every page is gripping in a way that's so devastating and just so unbelievable. In terms of sort of getting medical care and help, you were in a position where you could afford the best medical care. And I think, you highlight it in the book a few times in terms of your privileges and what you have access to. And I feel like it's a great thing that you have focused in on that, because what you're really showing is the best care that you could have afforded wasn't necessarily still behaving in the best for you at certain times. So, once you're going through the psychosis, you get admitted, you're in a private medical ward, and seemingly I'm reading your book thinking, well, I wonder what the rest of her book will be about, because seemingly now you're going to get better. You have got the best care. They are going to know that you've had an adverse reaction. The most sensible thing at this stage would be to take you off the drugs and see what happens. Now, that's where my mind was going, and I wondered how I was going to get through the rest of your book, knowing that I'd already worked out where your journey was about to go. But boy, was I wrong.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the most expensive care isn't always the best care. And adverse reactions to medication very often go unnoticed and undiagnosed. And the problem is that the side effects is that an adverse drug reaction looks like it mimics anxiety, or it can mimic anxiety and depression, because basically, if you think about it, I mean, the most common side effect of drug toxicity is what I was discussing, this thing called akathisia, which is kind of like intense anxiety, unable to sit still, unable to talk. Well, that can look very much like depression, can't it? It can look like acute anxiety, unless you know what you're looking for. Lack of sleep, right? Well, that's a well-known side. That's a well-known side effect of depression. So all of these things, the problem is that the side effects, that an adverse drug reaction can look very, very much like anxiety and depression. But also the problem is that the problem with private healthcare is that where I was, I think at the time it cost something like £6,000 a week, right? It would be more now because I was there in 2012, so nearly 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago. So the problem is this, which is that it's not really in these doctors' interest to get you out. It's in their interest to keep you in, particularly as the private insurance covers you for 6 week stretches, 4 to 6 week stretches. So I would find that at the end of 6 weeks, they would just go, oh, right, okay, you seem to be making a bit of progress now, so we'll let you out. Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being cynical, but to me, looking back, there seemed to be an awful lot of people in these private hospitals who were going through what I would consider just kind of normal reactions to distressing life events. Like, there were people who had been sacked from their jobs. There were people who had lost their someone close to them, so they were grieving. They were all on medication, and they were all being treated as if they were ill, rather than as if they were normal human beings going through a gamut of normal emotions. They were being treated as if there was something actually wrong with them. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that there are people with real mental illnesses, and that these medications might well help people with real medical conditions. In my humble view, there were an awful lot of people there who were actually being threatened with being sectioned if they were going to leave. And they were, in many instances, just going through normal life events. So what I was to discover is that adverse reactions are hugely overlooked by the medical profession, not just in private hospitals, but GPs, probably on the NHS. I've come because it's become my world. I've come across an awful lot of people who have had similar and far worse experiences than I have, not just with antidepressants, but actually with other types of drugs as well. That actually it's just something that isn't picked up particularly. But also, if you're presenting with something which was supposed to be a mental condition anyway, like once you've got a diagnosis, it's very difficult to persuade people that it's anything other than a diagnosis. And I always knew that it was that pill that had made me ill. Would they listen? No, they just wouldn't. And so initially, because I was there, and the psychosis remained another 2 days. And in that time, when I was interviewed by the psychiatrist, I was just out to lunch. I was looking, right, well, there are cameras in the ceiling. There's a suicide pact with God for me to, I need to kill my children. I mean, all sorts of nonsense. And the problem was that once that in their minds, I was absolutely crazy. And then once the effects of that pill had gone, then persuading them that I was perfectly normal and that it was the effects of the drug that had made me hallucinate was totally impossible. So the problem then was that they insisted that I stay, and that they then insisted that I was going to take more antidepressants and antipsychotics. And of course, those were the drugs that make me ill. So if you react badly to one antidepressant, you're going to react badly to all of them, because they're effectively the same thing. I'm not talking about, there are some people who don't have a life-threatening reaction to antidepressants, and they can go from having a not particularly good experience with one and then go on to another one which they sort of agrees with them better. But if you have a near allergic reaction to them, like I do, one is the same as all of them. So next thing is that I'm being put on these pills that are poisoning my body, and that became pretty serious.
So you were a year long going through various different pills, private medical care still at this point. Are you in and out of the hospital? And is your husband still around at this point supporting, or has he distanced himself?
Right. So then I'm in the hospital. They've insisted on giving me more drugs. And so I had been better. There had been a window when I was okay, 2 days in the hospital before, when the old drug had worn off and before the new drugs had kicked in. There was a 2-day window when I was fine. But then I start to get very ill again. So the akathisia, or the inability to sit still, starts kicking in. And of course, that makes me look like I'm suffering from worsening depression and anxiety because I can't sit still. So there are all these sort of therapies stuff, group therapies. I can't sit still. I'm having to leave. And they're like, well, she's too anxious to sit through the therapy. She's getting worse. More drugs. My ex-husband then has to move back in to look after the children, who are 10 and 11 at the time. So he moves back into the family home, which is of course very strange for them and for everybody. And then I'm in the private hospital for 4 weeks, and then I have to leave because the insurance runs out. It can come, but you're only allowed to be there for 4 weeks. And so then by the end of that 4 weeks, I'm very ill because of the drugs, and I become a drug addict as well, because you can't just kick the pills that, within a quite short amount of time, you're hooked. So I'm then discharged back to the old house where my husband is living with the children, and I'm dependent on the drugs. So I still know that it's the drugs that are making me ill, and I try to miss a dose, and it is terrifying. I'm just gripped with this, I think I'm dying. And also I'm absolutely terrified because if anybody discovers that I'm not taking the pills, I'm going to be back into that hospital sectioned again. So it's too frightening. Going through drug withdrawal is something that has to be carefully managed, even after 4 weeks. So it wasn't possible for me to just cleverly stop taking them, which had been my plan, because I sort of had it in my subconscious that, I knew it was the drugs that were making me ill. But it was physically and psychologically terrifying just to miss a dose. And I was so frightened that something really dangerous might happen to me, or that that I'll be found out and I'll end up back in the hospital, that I kept on taking them. So I kept on getting worse. And then there was a tipping point when I remember they suddenly gave me a very, very powerful antipsychotic, which is called olanzapine, called Zyprexa in the States. It's a heavy-duty antipsychotic, which is, I think, mainly used for people with schizophrenia. The side effects are horrific. So you can't stop eating, for one. So I remember I would just sit down and I would eat, an extraordinary amount of food. So I literally within a few months, I put on half of my body weight again, and I became literally catatonic. So I could not do anything. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't wash myself. I couldn't get dressed. I couldn't do anything at all. So I was literally catatonic and just incapacitated. And that was really the turning point for me. It's when I just went from being, I suppose, ill to very, very, very ill. And at that point, the children, I was just a dribbling, drooling mess that couldn't get out of bed. I could only just get out of bed to eat, to drink, whatever. I started, I've been a keep fit. I've been keen on keep fit. I've been training for a half marathon. I couldn't walk down the road pretty much I couldn't leave the house because I would have got lost. And I started trying to self-medicate. So I started smoking. And that very quickly went to a huge amount of cigarettes. By the end of that year, I was smoking 70 cigarettes a day. And I started drinking alcohol to try and get myself to sleep, or to try and self-medicate against the side effects of the. And it wasn't just that. I was on a cocktail then of antidepressants and antipsychotics, always going back to the private hospital. Sometimes they'd have as an inpatient. Sometimes I'd have to do day therapy. Sometimes I was so ill that I went back in as an inpatient. But always it was, you got treated. There was always a new diagnosis. Oh, we've got it sorted. We'll just taper you down. We'll give you a bit less Prozac and a bit more olanzapine, or a bit of this, or a bit more. I was on pretty much every single pill in the course of that year. every antidepressant, every antipsychotic, every mood stabilizer, and their diagnoses were treatment-resistant depression, bipolar, for which I was put on lithium. I mean, pretty much everything.
By this stage, was your body starting to get used to the drugs? Were you becoming an addict to the point where it was stabilizing you enough just to be able to function a little bit, or I was
literally, I couldn't function at all. I mean, I can tell you, in the course of that year, I didn't read a single book. People would say, I don't understand, why don't you just, you're not working, why don't you just sit down and watch some nice TV, some nice films? I couldn't do that. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I couldn't write an email. I remember it was so terrifying. It was like somebody had kidnapped my mind. So the simplest things, I remember Christmas coming and people would just go, well, why don't you just write a Christmas list for the kids? I couldn't do that. I could not do it. I couldn't think for long enough to do anything. I couldn't I would have forgotten how to use the computer. It was like somebody had hijacked my mind. It was terrifying. It was like this. It wasn't even as if I was being sedated, because sedated would mean that I was just sleepy. It was more than sedated. It was like having a total lobotomy. I couldn't remember things. So I wouldn't be able to do a simple thing like go to the supermarket, go shopping and get to the checkout, because I would have forgotten where the checkout is, or I would have forgotten what I went in there for, or I couldn't do anything normal, drive, or couldn't do anything at all. So my life became not really worth living because I couldn't do anything and I couldn't feel anything as well. That was the other thing. So I didn't really feel despair. I didn't feel anything at all. And I remember my mind thinking, gosh, this is strange, isn't it? So if I was with the children at all, but I wasn't well enough to actually look after the children. But if I was just with them, I remember thinking, if they ran out in front of a car, I wouldn't care, because all of my emotions had just been numbed completely. So I was totally able to look after them. And I remember my daughter, she just screamed once. She had a kind of self-induced panic attack because she wanted to get a reaction out of me, because she could sense that I just didn't care. Well, I didn't care because the drugs had taken away my empathy. That might be useful if someone was taking one antidepressant because it would numb you a little bit. Well, I was on so many, it completely numbed me totally. So I was unable to just feel any kind of empathy for anything. So I suppose that's also the other reason why I wasn't able to do normal things like read a book or watch a TV program, because so much of what is based on empathy, isn't it? You watch something because you can empathize with, or you listen to a conversation because you're empathizing with somebody, with what somebody is saying. Well, nothing was interesting. So
Did you feel at that point that you didn't want to go on any longer? Did you think about taking your own life?
By the end of that year, I did. I just thought, my life is just not worth living. I mean, there was nothing. There was just nothing. My children absolutely, they hated me. They said, they begged me to move out, which I did. In the middle of that year, I moved out of the family home because they were begging me to. They just said, well, we hate you. And why wouldn't they? I was just this dribbling wreck that just sat there, not being able to engage them. My kids they would bring home things they'd done at school or whatever, and I would just be sitting there dribbling, a side effect of the drugs, unable to just engage them at all. And they couldn't do anything, but they couldn't rationalize it. They couldn't not take it personally. They couldn't just go, oh, well, that's that was the person that I'd become. I'd become a mother who didn't love their kids, because that's what the drugs had done. So halfway through that year, my son just gave up. He just totally gave up. He just said, I just gave up on the idea that you'd ever be normal. That was it. You know, the doctors had sort of said, oh, you know, your mother's ill, but we've just got to give her a few drugs to make her better. Just got to tweak the medication, then she'll get better. So halfway through that year, my son was out of there. He was 10 years old, and he just totally gave up. I don't think that my daughter gave up. I think that she and I have an extraordinary relationship, and I don't think she couldn't ever give up on it. And right at the end, so basically in that year, I was in and out of this private hospital. And by the end of that year, I was on, I mean, in the book, it says 5 different drugs. I think actually it was more than that. It was something like 8, including the sleeping tablets and the mood stabilizers and so on and so forth. And it was exactly a year after I'd had the initial psychosis. And I was at the end. So I was living in this sort of basement flat. The children wouldn't come and visit me at all because it was awful. I was a smoker. I was drinking a bottle of vodka to try and get to sleep every night. So I was, the flat was a mess, etc., etc. And I had completely lost the will to live. And at that point, I really did think, I do want to kill myself just to end this agony. I was in physical agony. So sometimes when so I was heavily tranquilized, but you know, sometimes when those wore off, the akathisia would kick back in. So I was either completely out of it, or I was seized with this awful desire to move and was around. So I'd be out at 3 a.m, pacing the streets and that was such agony that then I would just have to go and get some. And then I would go to the off license, get some vodka to try and get myself to sleep. And then I'd just wake up feeling awful. But I looked like a homeless person. I couldn't dress myself or wash myself or whatever. So I'd had a carer in the early days. But after that, obviously, you know, who can afford that for a year? So I was left to my own devices. I just looked like a homeless person. Children wouldn't visit me. There was no hope for anything. Like my life had literally become not worth living at all. And so, yes, I was planning my own suicide. I was going to jump under a train.
It's just incredibly sad and incredibly shocking. And to even hear you say that out loud, it's just so real in terms of the experience that you were going through at that point. And I'm not sure, even reading the book, it's incredible how you got out of that feeling, how that feeling didn't drive you to take your own life. You know, feeling like you have nothing to live for is excruciating for anybody at any level, and it's incredibly hard to go through, especially with the amount of drugs you've piled into your body and everything else. And how did you try to transform that moment? And was it a transformation moment, or was it sort of a means to an end at that point? You just needed to not want to do that.
I did. I remember it quite clearly, and I mean, remember, I wasn't the person that I am now, so I didn't have anything to lose.
Yes.
I mean, what the hell was there to lose? I didn't have a relationship with my children. I didn't have my work, and there was never, for me, there was just not a chance in hell. I could work. I mean, I couldn't walk down this. I couldn't go to the bank or the supermarket pretty much without losing things. And my brain and my body was in such pain. My brain was in such pain. And there was nothing to do. Because imagine a life where you're not moved by a piece of music, or you can't. An emotionless life is just not a life at all. I didn't have anything. So there just wasn't anything to live for, because there was no future. I couldn't see a way out of this at all. It didn't seem possible that I could get off the drugs. And remember, there were people who were insisting that I was taking the drugs at the time because, did I say that? So basically, at the end of that year, I got discharged from the private hospital would no longer have me because the private insurance had run out. Okay, so I then end up back in my and the community care team of the the local health authority were coming and visiting me every day and giving me my drugs, because of course that was the thing that was supposed to be making me better. So there just didn't seem to be any chance. You know, I didn't think that I could detox off the drugs myself, and I was being force fed the drugs, and in any event, it wouldn't have been physically possible for me to have drugs on my own. I was on, as I say, 8 at the time. And anyway, I didn't have rational thought, wasn't really there. So taking my life seemed like a quite sensible option in a sense, because there wasn't a life to be taking. I just didn't have anything at all. So I mean, this sounds a bit woo-woo really, but I think that something stepped in at that point, because I remember very clearly just looking in the mirror at that point, and it was the morning that I was going to take my life. I was going to go to Ladbroke Grove train station, and I was going to jump under a train. I couldn't really think of any other way of doing it, because I wouldn't have been compass mentis enough to have planned anything more sophisticated, really. I wouldn't have known about dosages or whatever to try and take an overdose, and done it in a kind of like, I'm not sure. I don't know if there are good ways of killing yourself or bad ways, but I'm not sure that jumping under a train would be rationally the best way to do it. But anyway, I wasn't really conscious of I wouldn't have been able to have planned anything more elegant. So that's what I was planning to do that day. And I just remember very clearly looking in the mirror. I was living in this basement flat, no chance of the children ever visiting me. And I just saw myself as a 12-year-old who had lost my dad at the age of 12 to suicide. And I just saw, my daughter was 12 at the time, and I saw Lily's face in my eyes. And I just thought, she's going to be that same 12-year-old that I was, losing a parent. She'll never she might get over it, but she will be scarred in the same way that I was scarred by my father killing himself. I don't think it was even a rational thought, but someone from the treatment, the local health authority just came round at that point to give me my pills. And so my plan had been that she was going to come around, then I was going to go and kill myself. But anyway, her name was Teresa. She came in, and I had that vision, and I just said to her, I said, "You need to take me to hospital. I'm very ill." And she said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, really, I'm really ill. You need to take me to hospital." And she took me to the local NHS hospital, St. Charles Hospital. It's just around the corner. And I was chain smoking. I was an absolute wreck. And I sat in front of the psychiatrist. And I knew my way around the mental health system at this time. I knew that if I said, "I'm going to kill myself," they have to section you. So I just said those words. I said, I'm going to kill myself. Of course, that's a real challenge for a psychiatrist. They've got to find a bed for you. They've got to admit you at that point. So I could see he was slightly annoyed. How many beds at the time? But that did it. So they sectioned me. They admitted me. There was no bed. And for some bizarre reason, I haven't heard this before, they decided to take me off all of the drugs. So they detoxed me off all of the drugs. And so in 4 weeks, I was there I immediately regretted it. As soon as I'd been sectioned, I was like, Christ, what have I done? And then, of course, there was the agony of that they took me off, they cold turkeyed me off the drugs.
That's incredible.
Which I've never heard of.
And is that a standard procedure, or did you just, get lucky in this case?
I got lucky, and I've never heard of it again. What I should say for the people who are listening to this is that I know that it will be really challenging for people to hear somebody like me saying that I wanted to kill myself, and people might be thinking, what the hell, how selfish, she's got kids, et cetera, et cetera. I'm telling you, I hear a lot from people who are suffering the side effects of these medications, and your life becomes not worth living. So since then, I founded a campaigning website with somebody who I deeply respect, who had been on antidepressants for a long time and was suffering from withdrawal, and he killed himself as well. So I do hear of this quite a lot, and it is the medication that is making people this ill, that their life is not worth living, and was so in my case. Anyway, coming back to what happened is that I was cold turkeyed off all of the drugs. It was agonizing. To cut a long story short, after 4 weeks, I woke up and I was better. I was literally like, what the hell happened? I just couldn't believe it. I was like,
that's incredible.
What has happened? What am I doing? I'm in this mental hospital. What the hell happened in the last year? I just could not believe it.
Wow.
I'm trying to unravel it. And so at that point, I Googled antidepressant side effects, and it all came up. Some people react this way, that way, And so then I called someone who's a leading expert, who's the world's leading expert on antidepressants, who's someone I've become very close to, a professor called David Healy, who's written many books on this subject. And I contacted him and I said, is it possible that this whole thing could have been caused by a bad reaction to antidepressant? He said, you've no idea how lucky you are to have survived this. And he and I have become very close, and he helped me in writing my book and so on and so forth. So it began a very journey, and an amazing journey. So I was then in that mental hospital for another 6 weeks after I got better. They understood that I was better, but they wanted to kind of look after me. And so they allowed me to stay there, but I was allowed to go in and out as much as I wanted. So I was under a very loose section, or I don't know what it's called, and actually it to be a very good thing, because I could just get myself back on my feet. It became a safe haven for me to go back to, because I was like a child rediscovering her. And so I was like, suddenly I remember crying for the first time in a year, laughing for the first time in a year, and rebuilding my relationship. I was rebuilding my relationship with my children, and I was having to rebuild my life. I got from there. I got rented a home, rented a house so that the children would have Christmas, and it was a sort of safe haven for me to just get back on my feet again.
And did you feel that you needed to start to deal with the 12-year-old girl who was still mourning the trauma of her father? Is that something that you thought, or you knew at that time you needed to kind of handle?
No, that didn't happen until much later on. I mean, I just didn't really put it all together. At that time, it was like, suddenly, you can imagine, my whole life had been put on hold. It had been frozen. I didn't have anything at that point. My family had been given power of attorney over my affairs. So everything had been frozen. I hadn't worked for a year. My body as well. I was 12 stone instead of 8 stone. I hadn't been able to walk down the street, let alone run. So the first thing I did was to start going for runs again. And I remember, the joy of, my God, I was able to suddenly run. I've been a really keen runner. Well, I was able to run, first of all, just sort of round the block. Well, that was amazing. So I was discovering my physical self was coming back. I was, the weight just dropped off me. So within 2 or 3 months, I was kind of like back to my normal weight. And I remember just the joy of being able to I was like, oh God, I can read a book. I can read a newspaper. I can watch a film. It was really like an awakening. And of course, for the children, they'd got their mother back again, which was incredible for them, because they just thought, that's it, we haven't got a mother anymore. And they'd been as well deeply embarrassed with their friends. So you can imagine for them, it was very difficult. They wouldn't be seen at all with me at that time, because I was dribbling. I was like a dribbling drug addict. Well, not like a drug addict. I was a drug addict, a prescription drug addict, but I was like a homeless, chain-smoking junkie. So if I ever tried to, go with, my sister or something to go and pick them up at school, they were just terrified that their friends would see me or whatever. So rebuilding that relationship with them was the most important thing that I could do. And the thing that I was so upset about, so angry about, so upset about, was that they had lost their mother for a year. And that was the anger that drove me like nothing else. To what I needed to do was to prove to them, because at the time, of course, everybody said, "Oh, well, she was depressed and now she's got better." I was like, no, you don't understand. I wasn't depressed. I was distressed. I'd been poisoned for a year by drugs that have mimicked a very serious mental illness, right? Who was going to believe that? I was beginning to understand that because I was beginning to read other people's accounts that were identical to mine, and because I was reading a body of evidence and literature that showed this. But what became really important to me was that I needed to be able to prove that to the children, because I didn't want them to ever think that some mystery mental illness could take their mother away again. I needed them to know that the only thing that could get me into that state again was if somebody laced my drink with Prozac or an antidepressant. That was the only thing that could would lose them their mother for a year. So I was really, really motivated by proving to them that it was the drugs that had caused my illness. But also by then I was becoming aware that there were an awful lot of people that didn't have the potential power that I could have as a filmmaker and as someone that could get the listening of the general public to understand the harms that these drugs can do. So that began a really important journey to promote understanding that these drugs, whilst they can save lives, and I have always said these can save people's lives, it can give them a window of opportunity, of numbness to process whatever they need to process. That can happen. But for some people as well, they can be lethally dangerous. And I'm totally sure that if I hadn't ended up in that NHS hospital, if my private insurance hadn't have run out, I wouldn't be here to tell the tale. I would either have been killed by the concoction of drugs, the cocktail of so many different drugs reacting with each other, or I would have killed myself as I'd intended to do that day. So I wouldn't have been here to tell the tale. So it's Grace stepped in, and so I felt that it was almost my duty to tell my story, to warn people that this can happen, and my God, there are an awful lot of people that it's happened to, and happened far worse. And I think what I realised, I was on that cocktail of drugs for a year, and I didn't have any long-term side effects. People that I know who have been on that kind of dosage for more than a year, they have long-term serious side effects.
It's really interesting, just going back to the part of your story when you were first in receiving medical care, and you looked around and thought, some of these people, there could be other ways that they could deal with the pain that they're going through, if it's the loss of a job, sort of the day-to-day upsets and challenges that we all face. And some people react differently according to their lifestyle as well. It's, if you've got the money, especially, and you're living a very busy lifestyle, it might be an automatic reaction just to go and get the help, because we're very used as a society to find quick fixes, and we're told that that's the route to go as well. And you can see how easy it is to get into this cycle and to want the drug, to want to try it, to want to see if it works for you. And it's almost, we're not disregarding, like you mentioned before, anybody that, is mentally unstable and needs these, and it works for them. But for a lot of people who we're sort of talking about, and similar to your story, where you're going through challenges that could have been at that point handled in a different way. However, we're not equipped to necessarily know where to look for the help or know how to ask for it or even know how to handle that help. Is there anything that you've learned when you reflect back on the situation?
Totally, which is that quick fixes don't generally work on the whole. But quick fixes, the idea of quick fixes sell. I mean, look at what sells. People are get fit in 3 minutes. 5 minute workouts, get abs and get really great abs in 5 minutes, or meditate in 3 minutes or whatever. I mean, hard work, the idea of hard work, a hard journey doesn't sell well, does it? Quick fixes sell. But I think my mantra is that easy choices, easy fixes, hard life, hard choices, easy life. So I was up for the kind of quick fix. I wanted an easy life, and it ended up having huge ramifications. That desire for a quick fix, it cost me a year, cost me my relationship with my children. It cost the NHS, and I'm telling you, the cost it cost at least 50 grand in private health insurance. It would have cost the NHS in terms of drugs, in terms of my care, a fortune. And it could have cost me my life. So I think there's just there's no way round pain, unfortunately. You can try and go round it. You can try and take a pill that numbs you from it. You can try and drink to numb yourself from it, or you can eat to try and numb yourself, whatever. But actually, you can't go round it. And sometimes the easiest way is through it. But I think you do need to. I'm not discounting the fact that it's very difficult, but we need to all help each other through it. And I think what's really alienating is the idea that if people feel that they have to go through things alone, that's a very lonely journey. And I think that I had made myself very lonely by my own ego and desire to look so fucking great. Here I was supposed to be the great life. And if I wasn't going to have a great life married, I was going to be brilliant at being going through a divorce. So I deprive myself of vulnerability and connection. And I think it's an awful shame if people are taking pills as a substitute for connection and vulnerability and talking about their problems, because I don't think that you can, and actually the two are at opposite ends, aren't they? I mean, that taking antidepressants are things that numb you, whereas talking and vulnerability are things that connect you to other people and to yourself and to your own emotions. So there are opposite ends of the spectrum. So I know which of those I would choose any day of the week now. I mean, coming out of that, I don't take medication for anything. Obviously, if I got really ill, if I got cancer or something, of course I'd take medication. But thankfully, I've been blessed with incredible health in the last 2 months, and I haven't had as much as I don't think I've even had to take an aspirin for a headache. I've just been blessed. But if I have sleepless nights, dream of taking a sleeping tablet, I would just go, right, okay, sleepless nights, so what? I'll sleep tomorrow night. And generally I do. So I would not dream of taking, obviously I wouldn't take any psychiatric medication like antidepressants, or of course I wouldn't. But I'm pretty wary of taking any kind of medication, to be perfectly honest, because of the side effects. And I think that on the whole, unless you've got a serious illness, there are an awful lot of things that we can just get through.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I feel like you've covered this question off already. What have you learned about yourself? And you've really eloquently sort of expressed that just now. Is there anything else that you feel that you want to add to that at all, in terms of what you've learned about yourself?
I think I've learned that throughout my life, I haven't been able to feel my feelings. So it was no surprise that I wasn't able to feel, that I wasn't able to feel the despair of my marriage disappearing. So it's been a long journey to be able to sit with feelings. And by that, I mean, not really sitting with feelings and being okay with it, being okay with being sad, not trying to get myself out of it with anything, like even with shopping or with mindless eating or whatever, but actually just going, it's okay, it's all right to feel sad. That's actually probably a good thing to feel sad. It's not something to run away from at all. So being able to allow myself to sit with that has been a huge journey. And just to know that your emotions won't kill you, and also they're not forever. So that's the thing that is kind of seductive about emotions, isn't it? And the bad ones, they come along. Well, I've got to have that piece of cake, or I've got to drink or whatever, because otherwise the emotion won't go. Well, actually, the thing is that it will, and it's extraordinary. So I keep a journal now. And I'm like, God,
right. Last
week I thought the world was going to end. I thought I didn't have any friends. I thought I was never going to work again. That's what my journal is saying. How come I feel perfectly fine this week? Well, nothing has really happened. And that's because emotions, if you go through, you just come out the other end. But they come in disguise, don't they? They disguise themselves.
Yeah.
When you're always going to feel this way. Well, actually, if you just feel them, you get out the other side. So that's been an incredible journey, and I think it's just been it's been a journey about kind of love, really, and just I've had to forgive the people that poisoned me because they were probably doing their best at the time. And for a long time, I was very angry, and I had to probably just get through that anger. And no doubt, writing the book and channeling my energy into a campaign or whatever was a useful way of channeling that energy. And anger, like any other emotion, you do have to feel that as well. I've got to a point of forgiveness where, purely because I've got through the anger, and also I've had to take quite a lot of responsibility. I was responsible for what happened to me. I don't like the fact that I am, but I elected to take that pill. Nobody forced me to take the initial one. I took it. I wanted an escape route. I could have been more rigorous about reading what the side effects are, all sorts of things. So I did. I take responsibility for that. I wanted an easy way out. I don't do that anymore because I know that I'd be delighted if there was a magic pill, but there isn't, unfortunately, not for me.
Well, Katinka, we have one final question that we ask everybody on this show, and that's, what does becoming more human mean to you?
Becoming more human means being in touch with your emotions. It's about listening to all of your emotions, not shutting out the negative ones, that your body and your mind, they're incredible in telling you what you need to know. And if you ignore your emotions, then you're shutting out such an important part of you're shutting out information about your life, that all of these things are so important that if you're having sleepless nights, listen to what's keeping you awake, because it really might be the key to your happiness.
I'm Francesca Dinellen, and you've been listening to Becoming More Human, the podcast. You can follow Becoming More Human on Instagram, subscribe, rate and review the podcast on your podcast apps such as Spotify, Apple, Amazon and Google. And don't forget to check out our website for exclusive audio content on becomingmorehuman.co.uk. Join me next week for another inspiring conversation. Thank you for listening.